They crowned him a king before he even earned a roar. They painted him bold while you stood in the shadows, silent, observing, collecting every mistake they called a masterpiece. They never saw you coming, did they? While they paraded their leader like he was invincible, you sat with scars no one noticed, scars that taught you how to calculate destruction without raising your voice. This isn't just a story of power. This is the cold breath before the storm. The moment a soul trained in silence and sharpened in betrayal rises with fire, not to impress, but to dismantle. You didn't come for applause, you came to make history bleed. They said you'd never be more than background noise, but they forgot backgrounds hold shadow, and shadows learn everything. This is for the ones who were overlooked, for the ones laughed at, doubted, dismissed, for those who held their pain like a loaded weapon, waiting for the day they wouldn't just survive, they'd flip the entire board. You're not here to explain your move. You're here to remind the world, kings fall fastest when the court ignores the quiet one. They never saw you coming, did they? Because you didn't fit the role. You weren't loud enough, weren't rich enough, weren't born with the golden badge they respect, you know, the kind that says this one's approved. From the start, they watched you like background noise, not a threat, not a voice, just a shadow that kept showing up where it wasn't invited. They gave crowns to the loud ones, the shiny ones, the empty ones dressed in noise, and you sat in the back, not because you were weak, but because you were watching. Because the truth is, you never needed validation from a room built to exclude you. And somewhere deep inside, you knew the crown they refused to give you, you'll one day take without asking. You've been counted out so many times it almost became background music. Every closed door became normal. Every fake smile, every overlooked effort, they thought they were burying you in silence. But what they never realized was that silence is a seed. Every time they ignored your presence, they watered the storm you were becoming. You weren't sitting idle, you were evolving in the dark. They gave the spotlight to puppets while the monster in the shadows sharpened his claws. And that's what makes you dangerous now. Because you didn't grow in comfort. You grew in resistance. You didn't rise through applause, you rose through rejection. Your strength wasn't inherited. It was built one scar at a time in rooms where you weren't welcome, in moments when you had no one to clap for you but still moved forward anyway. You learned how to wear disrespect like armor. You turned humiliation into motivation, and every day you were underestimated was a day you were getting deadlier. They don't understand that the most dangerous people are the ones who learn to lead without a crown. Because when you're not handed authority, you build presence. When you're not given attention, you learn to command energy. They trained you by trying to ignore you. They built your empire by giving you nothing. And now, here you are, walking in rooms where their applause feels cheap. Because you've already survived the silence. Their praise comes too late. The damage has been done. You stopped waiting for them to recognize your worth. And the day that happened was the day you truly became untouchable. Because once a person realizes their value doesn't come from the approval of cowards, they become a force even kings can't control. You became your own crown. You didn't ask to be chosen, you chose yourself. You didn't need their invitation, you rewrote the guest list. And now, they look confused. They whisper about how you got here. They ask, when did he change? But you didn't change. You revealed. What they're seeing now is the version of you they prayed would never surface. The version that no longer seeks validation. The version that's not bitter, but brutal with purpose. You're not loud, but you're impossible to ignore. You don't beg, but your presence commands correction. You don't speak often, but when you do, they feel it in their bones. That's the power of not being given the crown. You learn to become the crown, to move like royalty in places they swore you'd never reach. They didn't give you the crown, so now they'll live with the regret of watching you wear one you forged in fire. They clapped when he spoke. They laughed when he walked into the room like he owned it. His words were loud, his presence louder. A room full of puppets nodding along, echoing his every breath like it was gospel. The so-called king, a walking illusion dressed in arrogance, built on smoke, mirrors, and a voice louder than truth. But what none of them ever noticed, what they were too busy applauding to even feel, was you, standing there unbothered, untouched, quietly dangerous. See, flexing is easy. Any man can puff his chest when no one's watching what's underneath. It's easy to fake strength when you're surrounded by yes men and blind followers. His voice shook the walls, but your silence rattled bones, because while they were hypnotized by the performance, you were seeing the strings. You weren't impressed by noise, you were dissecting it, studying his cracks, reading his rhythm, not to follow but to dismantle. That's what real ones do. They don't shout. They study, they don't flex, they focus. You didn't need a spotlight because you were already aflame. A quiet fire, unnoticed at first, but deadly once it spreads. And the most terrifying kind of fire isn't the one that screams. It's the one that smolders in silence, until suddenly nothing is left. His flex was a shield, a desperate cover-up for the fear he carried under that costume. That's what loud people never admit. That noise is a disguise. It covers the lack. It hides the insecurity. And the louder he got, the more clearly you saw it. He was terrified of someone like you, because your silence didn't just threaten his ego, it exposed his lie. You weren't like them. You didn't chase his approval. You didn't play into his script. You stood still, smirked, and let him collapse under the weight of pretending. You didn't interrupt his performance because you didn't have to. You knew eventually he'd forget the lines. Eventually he'd slip. And when he did, your silence would be the only sound left ringing in his ears. They called him powerful. You called him predictable. They saw a king. You saw a clown with a crown. And while he tried to flex like a lion, you moved like a storm. Calm, quiet, and coming for everything. He bragged about his position. You built your power where no one could reach it. He spent energy trying to look strong. You became strong by learning how to live with nothing but pain and willpower. The difference between you and him is simple. He needed noise. You mastered stillness. He needed validation. You needed none. Because silence is a language only the powerful understand. It's the sharpest blade in your arsenal, and it cuts deep. You didn't need to swing it. Just holding it was enough to make him sweat. Your silence said, I don't need to react. I already know how this ends. And that's what shattered him. That's what made him flinch every time you stepped into the room. He shouted until his voice cracked. You just stood there and watched him destroy himself. That's real power. That's what silence can do. That's what he never saw coming. They never saw you could have screamed at the top of your lungs and they still wouldn't have turned their heads. Because to them you were invisible, unimportant, forgettable. You weren't part of their story, not someone worthy of attention. They spoke your name like it was dust, like it held no weight. And that's fine, because you weren't trying to be seen. You were trying to build something they'd never understand. They overlooked you because you didn't fit their mold. You weren't made of their fake smiles and polished illusion. You didn't move like them, didn't speak like them, didn't beg like them. So they brushed you off, treated your presence like background static, something they could mute whenever it didn't serve their ego. But what they all forgot is that some of the deadliest storms come quiet and uninvited. They dismissed you as harmless, and that was their first mistake. You were always more than what they chose to see. But instead of fighting for their recognition, you disappeared into your own world. Not to escape, to evolve. They weren't watching when you turned your breakdowns into blueprints. They weren't around when you took the knives they threw and built a throne out of broken steel. They didn't see the nights you had to convince yourself to keep breathing, when everything inside you was begging for silence. But that's the difference. You lived in the dark. They just visited sometimes to take aesthetic pictures for sympathy. You were mocked for moving different. Now they study your steps like a map. You were laughed at for dreaming beyond your circumstances. Now they're trying to imitate the blueprint they never helped draw. That's how it always goes. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you. Then they act like they supported you all along. But deep down, they know they weren't there. They weren't part of the pain. They never saw the transformation happen. They only saw the results. The diamond, the fire, the sharpened edge. You became untouchable not because they finally saw your worth, but because you made yourself too powerful to be denied. You became the thing they whisper about when you leave the room, the presence they can't explain, the energy that makes people second-guess their own position. You didn't arrive with applause. You arrived with undeniable impact. And now their silence is filled with regret. You are the proof that real power doesn't need an audience. It grows in the absence of applause. It sharpens in the shadow. And when it arrives, it doesn't knock. It breaks the door. They don't see you when you're climbing. They don't see you when you're bleeding in silence, dragging your broken soul toward a vision only you can see. But when you get there, when your name starts echoing louder than their titles, they act like they've always known, but they didn't. And that's what makes your presence now feel like thunder. You were never invisible. You were just unreachable by their small minds. Let them watch. Let them pretend. Because the truth is, they only recognize value after it stops needing their validation. And you've become untouchable. Not just in skill, not just in strength, but in soul. Now even if they scream your name, it won't bring you back to their level. You're not ignoring them. You've just evolved beyond their language. He thought a name could protect him. He thought if he changed the letters, altered the tone, and dressed it in something new, he could outrun the past. But you and I both know you don't run from the truth. You bleed under it. And no name change can rewrite the moment his illusion cracked under your stare. He used to walk into rooms with his head held high, full of titles, full of noise. The world called him king. They worshipped the crown, not realizing it was plastic covered in gold paint. You never bowed, you never bought the act. You saw through the armor and recognized the fear hiding behind it. And now that the mirrors are breaking, now that his empire is shrinking, he's scrambling to rebrand his downfall. New name, new voice, new script. Hoping no one remembers the day he stood across from you and got dismantled without a single word. But you remember. He remembers. See, when you destroy someone without raising your voice, it doesn't leave bruises. It leaves echoes. The kind that keep them up at night, the kind they try to erase with reinvention. But you can't cover soul-level exposure with surface-level edits. You stripped him of his illusion. You didn't fight him, you undressed him with silence, and now every time he looks in the mirror, he doesn't see a new name. He sees the ghost of who he used to be before he met you. You didn't need to expose him publicly. You didn't need to shout, "Look at what he really is." That would have given him power, turned it into drama. Instead, you let time do what it does best. wrought the performance. The crowd got bored. The mask slipped. And he realized the king is only a king when the court believes the act. And now, he's rebranding, because even he doesn't believe it anymore. He speaks softer now. His steps aren't as loud. Not because he's humble, but because he's scared. Scared of what happens if you step into the room again. Because last time you didn't shout. You didn't break. You just smirked. And that moment, that's the moment that crushed his kingdom. A new name won't erase it. New clothes won't hide it. Because the damage wasn't physical, it was psychological. You bent his reality without touching him. And now he's trying to bury that version of himself under a pile of fake new beginnings. Let him try. Let him rename the empire. Let him start over. Because you're not chasing ghosts. You've already evolved past the entire game. You don't need to prove what he knows deep down. That his greatest fall wasn't a war. It was a moment. A single glance. A single smirk from you. That told him the truth he spent years hiding from. You were never the threat. You were the mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They don't clap. They don't flatter. They just show you exactly who you are. And when he looked at you, he saw the fraud he couldn't run from. So let him change his name. Let him paint over the past. Let him breathe in a new map. Because no matter what he calls himself now, you'll always be the reason the old name died. They'll call it a comeback. They'll say you returned, that you rose from the ashes. But you know better. You didn't come back, because you never left. You were watching, studying, sharpening. You were pulling your pieces back from the fire, not to rebuild, but to reconstruct into something they can't predict. This isn't redemption. This isn't some cinematic rise with dramatic music and slow applause. This is the warning shot they didn't hear in time. This is what it looks like when someone stops healing and starts aiming. They thought you were gone, broken, finished. What they didn't understand was that real threats don't announce themselves. Real threats don't knock, they kick the door down in silence. You didn't come back to be liked. You didn't come back for their handshakes or pity claps. You came back because now there's nothing holding you back. No loyalty left. No softness left. No illusions. You buried every trace of the version of you they knew. The one who tolerated. The one who excused. The one who explained. That version is dead. You didn't return. You replaced yourself. And now they're uneasy. They smile around you, but their eyes twitch. Their voices lower. Because this version of you doesn't beg, doesn't bend, doesn't bleed. You don't react. You observe. You don't chase. You trap. You don't forgive. You forget they ever mattered. They don't realize it yet. They think you're still playing by the old rules. They think you came back to prove something. But you're not in this for recognition. You're in it for something deeper. Something colder. Closure through control. They took your silence for surrender. But silence in your world is the sound before the strike, the calm before impact. And now that you're moving again, now that they see the weight in your eyes, they're starting to remember every moment they mocked you, laughed at you, wrote you off. This isn't about revenge. It's about revelation. You've seen your worst. You've touched rock bottom and made a home there. You've cracked and rebuilt. Not once, but again and again, until even your reflection started to fear you. And once a person survives that, they don't walk the same. They don't speak the same. They carry a stillness that unsettles everything fake around them. You became that stillness. They thought pain would kill you. They didn't know it would refine you. Now your pain walks beside you like a trained animal. Quiet, loyal, and deadly when called. You don't need to lash out. You don't need to explode. All you have to do now is exist in their space. Because your presence alone shakes everything built on lies. Your stare alone is a reminder that not everyone forgets. That some of us, we evolve past needing revenge and become the lesson itself. So let them tell themselves stories. Let them believe this is your comeback. Let them act like they understand what you've become. But deep down they know, You didn't rise. You transformed. And this isn't a victory dance. This isn't celebration. This is your final form entering the battlefield. Calm, focused, and ready to dismantle anything in your way. Not to prove a point, but to remind the world, you were never the echo. You were the storm that chose when to... They laughed at you. They laughed because you didn't interrupt. Because you didn't clap for their nonsense. Because you stood there, eyes calm, letting them assume they were the smart ones, the strong ones, the ones in control. They mistook your silence for stupidity, your patience for weakness. But here's the truth they'll never admit out loud. You weren't the fool. You were the plan all along. You knew what they wanted to see, so you showed them. You played the role. You gave them what their ego needed, someone to mock, someone beneath them, someone they could feel superior to. Because once people believe you're not a threat, they relax. They speak too freely. They drop their guard. And you listened. You documented. You watched their patterns until they became predictable scripts in your mind. See, that's the power of being overlooked. It gives you room to move. It gives you space to study the kingdom without ever stepping on the throne. They thought you were sitting quietly in confusion. But no, you were memorizing the blueprint. You were mastering the system, watching how it worked, waiting for the perfect moment, not to challenge the crown, but to collapse it from the inside. Because fools don't wait. Fools react. Fools scream when they're disrespected. But you didn't. You absorbed every slight, every joke, every smirk. Not because it didn't sting, but because you knew the sting had a purpose. You played your part like a ghost in their world. No spotlight, no noise, just presence. But the entire time, you were rigging the stage with explosives. You let them feel safe around you. That was the trap. You let them think you were weak. That was the setup. You let them think they had you figured out. That was your greatest lie. You see, real power isn't in pretending to be strong. It's in pretending to be nothing at all, until it's too late. And now that you've risen, now that your name carries weight, now that your footsteps echo in the places they used to laugh, they're scrambling, they're whispering behind locked doors. They're trying to figure out how the one they dismissed became the one they can't stop thinking about. You didn't get lucky. You weren't rescued. You engineered your own revenge in silence. Because the biggest weapon isn't rage, it's strategy. And you turned your pain into blueprint, your humiliation into calculations, your patience into a ticking clock. And now that it's zero, they're standing in the middle of your detonation. Let them try to rewrite the past. Let them say you got help. Let them claim you changed. But deep down, they know the truth. They were never smarter than you. They were just louder. And now, you don't need to prove them wrong. You've already replaced them. You don't need their chair at the table. You're building a new table, one that doesn't include fools wearing fake crowns. They thought you were the joke, but the punchline was yours the whole time. They thought you were lost, but the map, you drew it. You weren't the mistake in the system. You were the glitch it couldn't contain, the virus that smiled back as it infected every corner they thought they controlled. You weren't the fool, you were the fuse. And now, they're watching the plan explode with your name carved in every flame.